Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Rear View Mirror Chronicles, a podcast that takes history and makes it a little bit more fun. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster, and I love most, if not all, things historical. Today, we are journeying back to 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo, a battle that quite honestly could have gone either way. Either way, it changed the world as we know it today, and for whatever reason, it's not one that gets talked about very much, but it should. I'll be talking to a very special guest and an expert on Waterloo, Dr. Zac White, and reading from direct accounts of people who were actually there when it all went down. Zac has his own podcast called The Napoleonicist, and it's definitely worth checking out. So Waterloo marked the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the most prominent military and political figures in history. Napoleon had risen to power during the French Revolution and had become Emperor of the French. He had previously been exiled to the island of Elba, but he'd returned to France and reclaimed power before facing his ultimate defeat at Waterloo. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo actually brought an end to the Napoleonic era, which was characterized by years of warfare and territorial expansions led by Napoleon across Europe. His downfall led to the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in France and brought a period of relative stability to Europe after years and years of conflict. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo also played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the Congress of Vienna, a major diplomatic conference that took place after the Napoleonic Wars. And that conference actually aimed to redraw the map of Europe and restore the balance of power among the major European nations. Disrupted by Napoleon, of course. The decisions made at the Congress had a profound effect on European politics for decades, if not centuries to come. One of the common questions that we get asked is, was Wellington a good commander? I think he was. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, I think he's regarded as a skilled and effective military commander. He gained his reputation primarily through his leadership during the Napoleonic Wars and obviously the Battle of Waterloo, which we're about to talk about. And it's one of the most notable examples of, I think, his strategic and tactical prowess. Wellington's leadership at the Battle of Waterloo played a crucial role in the defeat of Napoleon's forces. He very carefully chose his defensive positions, and he managed to hold off repeated French attacks until the arrival of the Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher, which actually turned the tide of that battle in the favor of the 7th Coalition. He couldn't have done it without him. He was also known for his skill in defensive warfare, and he was exceptionally skilled at selecting strong defensive positions, effectively utilizing the terrain to the best of his advantage and deploying his troops to withstand enemy assaults. He also showed adaptability in his tactics and was able to adjust his strategies based on the situation on the ground in real time, the capabilities of his troops and the actions of his adversaries. This flexibility allowed him to effectively counter all sorts of different types of threats and challenges. And I think he emphasized discipline and training more than any other commander among his troops. He focused on maintaining the morale and the cohesion of his forces, which actually contributed to the effectiveness of them on the battlefield. In addition to his military talents, Wellington also possessed strong political and administrative skills. He served in various governmental and administrative positions, which effectively showed his ability to manage complex operations way beyond the battlefield. Overall, Wellington's leadership and tactical acumen played a very significant role in the defeat of Napoleon and at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. His reputation as a skilled commander earned him respect both during this time and in the annals of military history. The Battle of Waterloo also led to the establishment of the Concert of Europe, a system of diplomatic cooperation among the major European powers aimed at maintaining peace and stability on the continent. This system played a significant role in preventing major conflicts for several decades after the battle. Hey, Zac, welcome to the very first episode of Rear View Mirror Chronicles.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So the Battle of Waterloo took place in June 1815. It was Napoleon's final battle, as I mentioned, thought to be one of the most decisive battles in history. Can you explain to me briefly what Napoleon was hoping to achieve by engaging with the Allied army at Waterloo?
Well, Waterloo is quite an odd battle in the sense that it should never really have happened, because in 1814, Napoleon had been beaten by the Sixth Coalition, had been exiled to the island of Elba, but very quickly got bored. And as the Allies started to squabble amongst themselves, as they no longer had that kind of unifying purpose of fighting Napoleon, Napoleon saw his opportunity, really, to come back. He knew that the Bourbon monarchy, which had been restored on the French throne, was deeply unpopular. And he saw an opportunity to sort of divide and rule his opponents. And so he returned in March 1815. The army flocked to him, although there's a lot of debate about whether or not the civilians really wanted him to return. And with Napoleon back on the throne, the coalition allies had a unifying purpose again, and they unilaterally agreed that they would not conclude a separate peace with Napoleon until he had been comprehensively defeated, which left Napoleon with a problem, because he knew that he couldn't beat off the forces of Austria, Prussia, Britain, and Russia. And so he had to find a way to right the balance back in his favor. And the best way to do that was to strike at two armies which were based in Belgium, an Anglo-Dutch force under Wellington and a Prussian force under Blücher, which he did in this really daring move on the 15th of June, where he launched his army down a gap between the Anglo-Dutch army and the Prussian army, because he looked at their lines of communication and realized that they ran in opposite directions from one another. And because of that, he intended to use his army as a battering ram, sort of to try and smash through two gates and force these two armies to swing backwards away from each other so that he could defeat each one in turn. And it very nearly worked. On the 16th of June, there are two twin battles in effect, at Quatre Bras, which is Wellington's battle, and Ligny, which is Blücher's battle against Napoleon. And Napoleon won at Ligny, but didn't manage to crush the Prussians as he'd intended.
A major error. So what did that allow Wellington to actually do?
And because of that, Wellington was able to pull back towards Waterloo. The Prussians under Blücher had pulled back towards Wavre. And Wellington and Blücher had an agreement that if Wellington stood and fought at Waterloo, the Prussians would march to his aid. And so Wellington stood and fought, and it turned into a really horrendous bloodbath in a very confined area that's barely 3 miles wide and a mile between the Anglo-Dutch and French positions. It's estimated that anywhere between 40 and 60,000 men died, and the estimates on numbers are just crazy in terms of disparities.
40,000 to 60,000 men. It's such a large number.
It was a really drawn-out affair. Wellington described it as the closest run thing that he ever saw. It started with an artillery barrage on the British position. That began at 11:30. There's a very well-known almost siege confined within the right flank of the Allied position of Hougoumont, a farm chateau, where the Dutch force, alongside the British Guards, defended this vital forward position against relentless attack all day. About 1 o'clock, Napoleon launched what was meant to be his main sort of hammer blow on the Allied centre, sending forward an entire corps under D'Erlon, about 12,000 men, to just smash their way through the Anglo-Dutch lines. And it came very close to working.
That's astounding, Zac. And I can see that you have these amazing oral accounts of what took place. So let's go through the battle now, because you've given us the background. Let's hear the first account, which is from John Scott, who was amazingly, a triangle player in the Black Watch, which is one of the oldest and renowned infantry regiments in the British Army.
The Black Watch is an iconic Scottish unit, has a brilliant pedigree of holding its own, and was a really trusted unit from Wellington. A triangle player was exactly what it sounds, a musician. This lad was only about 11 or 12 at the time, and his role was to play the triangle within the regimental band. And a lot of bandsmen were, as Eamon's work has shown, actually used not to play music during battles to try and drown out the cries of wounded, but instead were there to act as stretcher bearers, to carry the wounded away. But this 11-year-old clearly couldn't carry anyone away, so he was just sort of left to his own devices over the course of the battle.
It's astounding, an 11-year-old. Let me read from him now. I was brought up in the army and was in Belgium in June 1815. What I had to do was play the triangle during battle. I was in the Black Watch, but my arms weren't much, and all I had were a pistol and a small sword. Quatre Bras was a good deal worse than Waterloo, in my opinion. My father spoke Gaelic as well as English, and a lot of the Black Watch spoke Gaelic, but Wellington had said that he would not have it, for by living God he would have every man speak English. After the Battle of Quatre Bras, we got a rest, and then we had to march to Waterloo. At about 11 o'clock on the night of the 17th of June, it commenced to rain heavily. The rain poured as hard as it could, and what a night that was. It was in a potato field we were in, but I wrapped my cloak around me and got a good sleep. I remember I lay just on the side of a little bank and the water was running down on both sides of me, while in the morning there were 2 inches of mud around us. At daylight we were up and each of us got a glass of rum and the ship's biscuit. As for the battle, I remember very little. It was nothing but fighting and excitement all day long. The fighting went on, but the smoke hung so thick around us that we could see little. There was nothing but firing and shouting on all sides. I was not frightened. I was too excited for anything. I played my triangle and shouted "Scotland forever" until I was hoarse and I could scarcely speak a word. I never got a scratch though, but I think it must have been my height that saved me. I was so little that I had not much risk to run. That's from John Scott. And the Battle of Quatre Bras that he talked about was actually fought on the 16th of June, so 2 days earlier. And it was actually a preliminary engagement to the decisive Battle of Waterloo that occurred, a couple of days later. And really interestingly, Napoleon won that one. And we need to remind ourselves as well that this was an Allied army. So there's German units, there's Dutch and Belgian units, and even within the British Army, there's a huge ponderance of Irish and Scottish units as well.
There absolutely were. A chap called Jim Deary at Maynooth University in Ireland has been doing some brilliant work on this, and he's found that even within the regiments that were named as English regiments, there were about a third of troops who were recruited from Ireland. So in many respects, there's this huge Irish contingent, and it's really interesting to hear the extract pick up on the use of Gaelic, which was obviously a language of Ireland, but also a language of Scotland, and that kind of attempt to suppress that. And it's really interesting how that reflects how Waterloo is used later on to kind of forge this British identity around the fact that soldiers from all 4 nations within the United Kingdom had fought and served to distinction in the Napoleonic Wars. And there's a lot of mutual respect between English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish troops about the fact that they can completely depend on one another to fight as hard as they need to do.
He mentions the conditions. It was famously miserable, wasn't it? And one of the reasons Napoleon lost was because of the thick mud, because he couldn't actually get his guns in order because the mud had just bogged them down. But it was a grim couple of days in the lead up to the battle.
It was a really grim night. And it's interesting what you say about the mud, because that's one of the things that I've been asking people as part of this Waterloo Remembered program that I've put together about the role that the mud did or didn't play. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not the ground could have dried out anymore within that couple of hours. Because for those who haven't been to the battlefield itself, the ground is clay. It just retains the moisture. And if it's rained the night before and you go walking on the battlefield, you find it just cakes to your shoes, regardless of what time of the day. So it's a really interesting point that you raised there about that debate on the mud. But the conditions were awful. John Scott seems to be one of the lucky ones in that he got some food. And when you read a lot of accounts from the British troops during this period, actually what they do the night before is they go in search of plunder, and they plunder the locals of food and so on to be able to eat the night before the battle. And the officers just turn a blind eye to it because they know their men have got to eat to have the strength to fight the next day.
I know, and yet there is a young boy, a kid, playing a triangle in the thick of it, shouting "Scotland forever." Hard to imagine.
Kind of funny because it's so ridiculous to me in the middle of all of this carnage. And the extract really brings together how disorientating it was with all of the smoke from the musket fire, the screams of the wounded. You've got this little 11 or 12-year-old who's banging his triangle as hard as he can, just squealing "Scotland forever" at the top of his voice. You must wonder what the soldiers thought about this little one in their midst, putting himself in danger completely pointlessly, and whether they just kind of were too busy to worry about him, or whether he was actually helping in his own way by boosting their morale.
Let's just talk about a conversation that Thomas Creevey has with Wellington just before the battle.
Absolutely.
Will you let me ask you, Duke, what you think you will make of it? He stopped and looked at me directly and said in a most natural manner, "By God, I think Blücher and myself can do this thing, you know." "Do you calculate," I asked, "upon any desertion in Bonaparte's army?" "Not a man," he said, "from colonel to the private in a regiment, both inclusive. We may pick up a marshal or two, perhaps, but they are not worth a damn." "What do you reckon," I asked, "upon any support from the French king's troops at Alost?" This is the French king Louis XVIII, of course, who was in fact with his home guard some 15 miles west of Brussels. "Oh," said Wellington, "don't mention such fellows. No, I think Blücher and I can do the business." And then seeing a private soldier of one of our infantry regiments entering the park, gaping at the statues and images, "There," he said, pointing at the soldier, "it all depends on that article whether we do the business or not. Give me enough of it and I'm sure I can." And that was Thomas Creevey. So what was he doing near the Battle of Waterloo, Zac?
Well, Creevey was a Whig politician, and he went to Brussels because of the ill health of his wife. And so it was kind of by chance that he found himself in Brussels. They'd gone there for a change of air, and Napoleon's return meant that suddenly Brussels was a much more dangerous place to be than it had previously been. But they stayed over the course of the build-up of troops in Belgium prior to Waterloo. And he met Wellington on two occasions, immediately before, or shortly before the battle, and then immediately afterwards. It's a fantastic quote. Nick reads the whole extract in full in the Waterloo Remembered Voices from the Battlefield series. This quote shows so much about Wellington's mindset because it's a bit of a political dig in the section immediately before what we've just heard. And it also says so much about his belief in the British troops that come what may, if he's got enough of them, he absolutely knows that he could defeat Napoleon.
Wellington is rude, though, and not just about the other nations. I mean, this is a coalition after all. There are Dutch troops at Waterloo. The Dutch troops at Waterloo are often overlooked, but they play an extraordinarily important role, particularly at the end.
They absolutely do. What people often miss is the fact that Waterloo isn't Britain versus France. I was speaking to a member of the Waterloo Uncovered team, an army veteran called Ben Mead, who likened the Allied victory at Waterloo to being a sort of 19th century version of NATO, in the sense that, as you say, it's a coalition victory. And Wellington's army is only made up of a third of British troops. A third of the force is British. And the rest, as you say, are Dutch, Belgian, some King's German Legion troops in there, and some Brunswickers. They play a really crucial role. And I think, in a sense, it says a lot about what Wellington believed the men could really do when it came to it, that he placed King's German Legion troops in La Haye-Sainte, one of the really important forward positions just in front of the Allied centre. And there are also Dutch troops fighting alongside the British Guard at Hougoumont. So for all that he was rude about other nations' troops at times, when it really came down to it, he must have known that they would stand and fight and do the job, because he wouldn't have put them in some of the most crucial positions of the entire battle.
So the fighting is now underway, and we've heard from the triangle player, Wee John Scott. Let's hear from Jacques-François Martin, who takes part in the first big infantry assault, kind of a blunt instrument, really, just a massive infantry assault on the Allied left wing. Can you set this one up for me, please?
Yes, so this is that initial hammer blow. It's meant to be Napoleon's main attack, actually. It's meant to end the whole battle in one decisive move. And he sends an entire corps under d'Erlon, somewhere in the region of 12,000 men, in this vast column. Effectively, we call it a column, but in effect it's a sort of a rectangle that's just used to smash its way forward by being able to soak up the punishment of artillery fire and musket fire and keep on coming. And that kind of unnerving effect is meant, and in many cases is very successful at just pushing back whatever stands in its way. It's sort of got this irresistible momentum to it.
But effectively, Napoleon is sacrificing men's lives, French men's lives. He knows that thousands of them are going to die in the hope that one lightning strike, one attack will actually break Wellington. What an audacious move.
It had never worked, interestingly, against British troops over the course of the Peninsular War between 1808 and 1814, but it had worked across Europe. And so Napoleon tried it again. I have to say it came very close to winning. When you read the accounts, it's very clear that the Anglo-Dutch army in the centre was starting to shake. It was starting to pull back in the face of this onslaught.
And this, of course, is where Picton was killed.
He was one of Wellington's most trusted commanders, had served with him all the way through the Peninsular War. And as the Allied centre begins to buckle, there's a very famous incident, the charge of the Household and Union Heavy Cavalry Brigades. The vast majority of the Allied heavy cavalry just sweeps in at the absolute perfect moment, because this French column has just crossed through a hedge. They've been shaken. They're slightly unsettled by the fact that they're out of formation. And just as they're trying to reform for that final push, in sweep the British heavy cavalry from all sides, and they shatter the entire corps. It just takes that entire unit out of the battle for hours.
One of the best uses of British cavalry in history, I'd say, and one of the most disastrous. Here's what Jacques-François Martin had to say about it. We were in column at the moment the order arrived to climb the position and to seize with the bayonet the English batteries and anything else that offered resistance. The ridge line bristled with their cannon and was covered with their troops. It appeared impregnable. No matter, the order had arrived and charge was beaten, and the shout "Vive la France" came from every mouth, and we marched ahead in closed ranks, aligned as if on parade. I can attest to the fact that at this critical moment I did not see a single cowardly thought painted on the faces of our soldiers. The same order, the same gaiety shone there as before. However, the shot had already killed many, and this promised that the carnage would be terrible when we arrived on their guns. Death crept upon us from every side. Entire ranks disappeared under the case shot, but nothing could stop our march. It continued with the same order as before, with the same precision. The dead were immediately replaced by those who followed. The ranks, although becoming thinner, remained in good order. Finally, we arrived on the height. Now we could reap the reward of such bravery. Already the English began to give way. Already their guns retired at the gallop. A hollow road lined with hedges was the only obstacle which still separated us from them. Our soldiers did not wait for the order to cross it. They rushed over it, jumped over the hedges, and broke ranks to run on against the enemy. Fatal carelessness. We were forced to get them back into order. We held them back in order to rally them. At the moment that I succeeded in pushing one of them back into the ranks, I saw him fall at my feet from a saber blow. I turned quickly. The English cavalry had charged us from every direction, and we were cut to pieces. I only had time to force myself into the crowd to avoid the same fate. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. I mean, Zac, what an amazing account, and how terrifying would that have been?
It's incredibly vivid, and I think it's a really good way to start to reflect on the human toll, because that's what's so fantastic about studying the Napoleonic Wars, that you've got so many very honest, quite moving and touching eyewitness accounts from Waterloo, but from the entire conflict, due to increases of literacy and so on during this period. And this gives us a really clear sense of the raw fear that must have gone through that entire unit as they saw what was coming at them and just knew that there was nothing they could do. And it says so much about their reaction that Jacques-François' only defense in this situation is just throw himself into the desperate huddle and hope that he doesn't get hit by a saber blow.
And then, of course, the British cavalry overreach and they charge off towards the French guns who counterattack. And in the end, it's a disaster for the cavalry. A bloodbath. And then it all takes over on the western flank, and we have another account from Major George Bering, who served with the King's German Legion.
Bering was one of the more senior commanders within La Haye on the day. This is a beautiful account that we're about to hear. And the King's German Legion has a really interesting history that I explored with Haley in a specific interview on the KGL and their role within Waterloo. They were raised in Hanover when Napoleon moved into Hanover, and people didn't want to be kind of drawn into Napoleon's armies. They wanted to serve with the British. They're another unit that has this really dependable reputation. Admittedly, that unit became kind of watered down as they weren't able to source new recruits from Hanover, and so they had to make up the numbers with deserters in some cases from French army. But nonetheless, another unit that could be utterly trusted to hold the line and has a great reputation and was really respected by the British troops, which is quite rare because quite often the British rank and file were quite scathing about other nations, particularly the Spanish and sometimes the Portuguese.
All right, well, let's hear George Baring's account now. Many of the men, though covered with wounds, could not be brought to retire. So long as our officers fight, we can stand, was their constant reply. We will not stir from the spot. It would be an injustice to a skirmisher by the name of Frederick Lindau if I did not mention him. Bleeding from 2 wounds in the head and carrying in his pocket a considerable bag of gold that he had taken from an enemy officer, he stood at the small back barn door and from thence defended the main entrance in his front. I told him to go back as the cloth about his head was not sufficient to stop the strong flow of blood. He, however, as regardless of his wounds as of his gold, answered, he would be a scoundrel that deserted you, so long as his head is on his shoulders. George Baring's account of the steadfastness of the rank and file really comes through here. It's quite astounding. And it was such a brutal assault that went on all day and swung both ways on the farm that they were actually trying to defend. Wellington was actually very rude about his own troops. He said that they were the scum of the earth and that they were drawn from the lowest socio-economic groups in the late 18th century Britain and Ireland. That being the case, why did they fight? In this case, the Germans had a fairly tenuous connection to the British king. Why did they fight so hard at Waterloo? I mean, it's just ferocious, and you're fighting for a man that completely disregards you.
They absolutely do. I think it says so much about the KGL, particularly at La Haye-Saint, that the reason that the farm falls is actually because they run out of ammunition. They can't get the ammunition for their guns, partly because the farm ends up being sort of slightly cut off. And they don't pull out when they've got a couple of rounds left. They wait until they've fired every last shot and they fight their way out with bayonets, which says so much about their tenacity.
Literally fighting for their lives.
In terms of why do they fight, this is another really big, fascinating topic and something that I've been interested in for years. And I think it comes down to a few things. One is camaraderie between their comrades, that actually as a unit and particularly as a mess, they trust one another to keep fighting because they know that their collective survival depends on everybody doing their bit. In terms of loyalty, there's certainly a degree of loyalty to the unit and the unit's history. Personally, I don't really believe that there was any devotion to king and country. I know a lot of is made of that, but during this period, the idea of these men without any real rights being invested in some kind of political system, there isn't really any sense that, from what I've read at least, that they fight for their king. They fight for each other and they fight for the reputation of their unit.
So we see the climax of the battle arriving. Napoleon sends his Imperial Guard up the hill. They are greeted by a barrage of musketry from the British Guards and some Dutch troops. They break them, they smash them, and the battle is over. And the French army retreats in chaos. Let's hear from Thomas Creevey again. If you remember, he's the Whig politician who is in Brussels with his wife. This is what he had to say about what Wellington was thinking after the battle had ended. The first thing I did, of course, was to put out my hand and congratulate him upon his victory. He made a variety of observations in his short, natural, blunt way, but with the greatest gravity at all time, and without the least approach to anything like triumph or joy. Wellington says, "It has been a damn serious business. Blücher and I have lost 30,000 men. It has been a damn nice thing, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Blücher lost 14,000 men on Friday night and got so licked I couldn't find him on the Saturday morning, so I was obliged to fall back to keep up my communication with him." As Wellington walked about, he praised greatly those guards who kept the farm, meaning Houboumont, of course, against the repeated attacks of the French. And then he praised all our troops, uttering repeated expressions of astonishment at our men's courage. He repeated so often, "It's been so nice a thing, so nearly run a thing," that I asked him if the French had fought better than he had seen before, better than he expected. "No," he said, They've always fought the same since I first saw them at Wimmera. And then he said, by God, I don't think it would have done if I had not been there. So Wellington was actually quite somber after that victory. I mean, he'd lost a lot of men. So, Zac, Wellington was quite somber after that battle. I mean, he wasn't euphoric at all, was he?
Not at all. Wellington was really deeply affected by Waterloo, but I think he also was deeply affected on other occasions when there had been these absolute bloodbath-style battles. After the Siege of Badajoz in 1812, which was a really horrific assault on some really well-defended breaches into the city, it's estimated about 4,000 men were killed in a really confined space. He walked the breaches and was found weeping by Picton, who we mentioned earlier. And Picton had no clue what the matter was with Wellington. He turns around and says, what's wrong with you? And Wellington realized that he couldn't actually explain the situation to Picton because he didn't get it. But essentially, he was crying.
Because he had seen so many of his own men killed.
Because he'd seen so many of his men killed. And for all that Wellington was very rude about his men, calling them the scum of the earth, as you say, and did so on multiple occasions, he certainly didn't like them. He recognized their dependability, and he was never one to waste his men's lives. And I think that comes across particularly in this account from Creevey, where he could see the devastation that had been caused to his army and knew that that victory had been bought with their blood. And I think it also affected him a lot that his staff officers, the vast majority of his staff officers, were killed in the battle. So the people that he had the closest relationship with were also killed. And there's a very moving letter that he wrote to Lord Aberdeen, informing him of the death of his brother, Alexander Gordon, who had been a senior member of Wellington's staff. That is just this outpouring of emotion that really reflects that what Creevey saw wasn't a one-off. Wellington was deeply moved, deeply shaken by what had happened at Waterloo.
And it changed him, of course, and he lost a lot of friends at that battle too. Let's hear from Wellington himself in a letter that he wrote to Lord Aberdeen about the death of his dear brother, Alexander Gordon. You will readily give credit to the existence of extreme grief with which I announce to you the death of your gallant brother. In consequence of wounds received in our great battle yesterday, he had served me most zealously for many years and many trying occasions, but he had never rendered himself more useful and had never distinguished himself more than in these late actions. He received the wound which occasions his death when rallying one of Brunswick's battalions which was shaking a little, and he lived long enough to be informed by myself of the glorious results of our actions, to which he had so much contributed by his active and zealous assistance. I cannot express to you the regret and sorrow with which I look around me, as I contemplate the loss which I have sustained, particularly in your brother. The glory resulting from such actions, so dearly bought, is of no consolation to me. I mean, it's heartfelt, and Wellington is clearly grieving, and he talks about how the war is, and he grieves for his fellow officers, but it doesn't seem to me that he actually gives a damn for the 30,000 odd men that, the rank and file men that died under his watch. What do you think about that, Zac?
I have exactly the same question about it, because in one sense, he's writing to Lord Aberdeen about the death of his brother. And so he would kind of focus on his closest friends and relations. But I think with Wellington, there was always a sense that he didn't like to lose men unnecessarily. And a lot of the point about Waterloo is that he sat on the defensive waiting for the Prussians to arrive. And the reason that the entire French army collapses after the failure of the Imperial Guard assault is because the Prussians came crashing in on the French right flank. At roughly the same moment, there'd been vicious fighting around Pont-Noir for a lot of the afternoon, and it all kind of comes together. This is speculation, but I do wonder if Wellington disliked the fact that he just had to sit there and wait and soak up the punishment and knew there was nothing he could do until the Prussians arrived and until the balance tipped in his favour. But yeah, it's a really interesting point that you make about how it's not clear quite who he's mourning. But although he was definitely mourning the loss of his close friends, I think he also mourned the loss of so many of his army as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. He's quoted as saying, and I quote this, "Believe me, nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." As I was going through this, I was also wondering what the feeling was in Brussels as this battle was actually taking place. There's actually a report from Thomas Healy, an account about the panic that was taking place in Brussels itself, because they were just hearing rumors all day long. Wellington had won, Wellington had lost, Napoleon had won, Napoleon had lost. Let's hear from Thomas Healy and hear what was actually happening there and then. Fleeing hussars were closely followed by a group of mounted women. They were well mounted, riding astride on men's saddles. They had on boots and trousers like dragoons and wore a gown overall with small round bonnets on their heads. They rode well, for their horses made the fire fly out of the pavement. I shall never forget them, for they galloped straight forward, and if the devil had been in the way, they would have went over him. Fancy the quantity of baggage that follows a regiment of soldiers in England. Say 600 or 700 men. And then fancy the baggage, the hospital wagons, the ammunition carts, and the officers' wagons, and the officers' baggage, animals, etc., belonging to an army of 70,000 men. And then include the soldiers advancing and the wounded leaving the field. Every road leading to the field crammed up with all of the above requisites of the army. And then, all in a moment, the word comes like wildfire, crying that the British are beaten or the British are retreating. The whole of this mass, which was veering away from the front, then rounds immediately and begins to gallop to the front. But of course they cannot proceed, for at every 30 to 40 yards a concussion takes place, and they are all down together at one spot on the road. There are over 20 horses that are killed, and of course the men share the same fate. I mean, it's just complete chaos. It's the one thing to be on the battlefield, but by the sounds of it, it's actually no better on the road to Brussels.
In some ways, I wonder if, although it's not as bad as being there and risking your life from all the flying bullets and cannonballs and so on, in a way it's sort of worse, because not only is there nothing you can do about it, but you're hearing all of these rumors. And there's a really famous incident that causes panic amongst the population, partly because Brussels has a significant British expat community, and they didn't particularly want to be caught up in Napoleon's troops sweeping into Brussels. But there was genuine panic when some hussars from the Duke of Cumberland's regiment fled from the battle, and they streamed into the city, claiming that the French were on their heels. And actually, it was a load of rubbish. And people have been quite harsh about that unit, but actually it's more like a yeomanry unit. They're sort of volunteers. They probably shouldn't have been anywhere near the battle anyway. They weren't really up to the task. But it causes this huge panic, and people's kind of streaming into the streets, and causes absolute chaos as people try and get away because they are fearful of the consequences of this victorious French army.
Zac, thank you so much for joining me on my first podcast. It's been absolutely wonderful. I've been to Waterloo, I've walked the battlefield, but I hadn't read any of those accounts before, so thank you for those alone.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
After the Napoleonic Wars, Wellington played various roles in British politics and military affairs. He served as Master General of the Ordnance, as Ambassador to France, and twice as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom between 1828 and 1830, and again in 1834. He had two children, Arthur Richard Wellesley, 2nd Duke of Wellington. Arthur Richard was commonly known as Lord Durrow, after one of his father's titles, and he was born in 1807. He succeeded his father as the 2nd Duke of Wellington upon his father's death. Wellington's second child was Lady Mary Charlotte Anne Wellesley. Lady Mary was known for her beauty and her charm, but tragically she died at the age of 20 in 1831 while her father was Prime Minister. Her death was a great sorrow for Wellington, and I don't think he ever really recovered from it. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please like it, share it, and subscribe, and all that sort of thing. Thanks for listening in, guys. Bye for now.